simple life for your money, that you cannot trust a friend, that love comes to an end. What would I have done? What would I have done? What would I have done if I had known then? But I know now that you never would be true, that you would leave me without you, that I would have to be alone, that every night I'd cry into the phone door. What would I have done? I never used to be a man, and now I know, now I understand. I know it's over, it's over, it's over, it's over, it's over, it's over, it's over. If I had known then what I know what would I have done? What would I have done?
Oh, I feel something, baby. And I want you to know about it. See, I want you to feel it too. So just listen to me, baby. Can't stop me now. Hear what I say. My feet want to move, so get out my way. I'm gonna have my say. I'm going to every discotheque. I'm gonna dance, dance, dance. Ooh, till the break of day. I say shame, shame, shame. Oh, shame on you if you can't dance too. I said shame, 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 shame on you if you can't dance too. Don't stop the motion if you get the notion. You can't stop the groove, cause you just won't move. Got my sunroof down, got my diamond in the back. Put on the shaggy ring of woman if you thought shame on you, girl, if you can't dance too. I said shame, 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 shame on you if you can't dance too. If you don't want to come, remember one monkey don't stop no show. My body needs extra, ain't gonna flow. Yes, I'm going on and find a dancing man. If you really think you're fast, try to catch me if you can. Shame, shame, shame. Whoa! Shame on you, girl, if you can't dance too. I said shame, 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 shame on you if you can't dance too. Let's give it to me. I know you can dance, baby. I know you. Ooh, give it, baby. Oh, shame, shame, shame. Yeah, yeah. Oh, shame on you if you can't dance too. Oh, that shame, 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 shame on you if you can't dance too. Don't stop the motion if you get the notion. You can't stop the groove, cause you just won't move. Got my sunroof
Good evening. There we go. We'll do it again. Good evening. I like that. That's better. It's good. My colleague does that. I like that call and response. Just FYI, the music we were just playing was Jonathan had provided us with that playlist, and I thought it was great. I love an author with walk-on music. So I asked him if it was available on his website, and he said no, but you can find him on Spotify at Jonathan Lethem, all one word, and you'll find that playlist and a bunch of his playlists that his children also put together, he said. But it might be fun to read the book and listen to the music at the same time. My name is Cleve Corner. I'm the manager of author and speaker engagement here at the Pratt Library. Thanks for coming out this evening. Tonight, Jonathan and Lysley are going to be in conversation for about 40 to 45 minutes. Jonathan's going to read first, and then Leslie's going to ask him questions, and then we'll have time for your questions. We'll have a microphone there, and we will have a microphone over here. We ask that you take your questions to the microphone. We do have a hybrid program, and people are watching back home. That way they can hear the question. I want to thank our book selling partners, Greedy Reads, who are up front selling books. If you haven't bought a book, please buy a book. After the program, Jonathan will be happy to sign your book. A couple other things. We have a bunch of programs here at the Pratt. It's still November, December to go, and Walter Mosley tickets are still available. That program is on November 1st, so if you're interested, go to our website, Writers Live, click on Walter Mosley. You can come to the program. We're giving away free books, too, so you can't beat it. Tonight, I'm happy to welcome Jonathan Lethem to the Pratt Library to discuss his latest book, Brooklyn crime novel. In it, he pulls apart the traditional crime novel while examining a Brooklyn neighborhood over the course of 50 years. He will be joined in conversation this evening by fellow novelist Lysley Tenorio. Jonathan Lethem is a best-selling author of 13 novels, which include The Feral Detective, The Arrest, The Fortress of Solitude, and Motherless, Brooklyn. He is currently a creative writing and English professor at Pomona College in California. Lysley Tenorio is the author of the novel The Son of Good Fortune and the story collection Monstrous. He is a professor in the writing seminars at Johns Hopkins University. Author Susan Straight called Brooklyn crime novel like a sidewalk studded with diamonds, individual moments in life documented as vividly as that, the reader walking along with the characters through a borough, through buildings and streets and bedrooms, through lifetimes in an American place. Jonathan Lethem has layered a universe here in a devastatingly meticulous document, a tender yet unsentimental remembrance for an entire world. In Booklist starred review, they wrote that the book is an intricately excavated, breathtaking tale of imperiled childhood in a fitfully gentrifying Brooklyn neighborhood. With Brooklyn as a microcosm of human folly and strife, Lethem's virtuoso, many-faceted novel is trenchant, hilarious, wrenching, and tender. And author Percival Everett commented, "The levels of mystery here astound. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and then the parts decide to act alone and challenge the whole." Lethem is not only interrogating the form of the crime novel, but the venture of storytelling itself. All of this while remaining a joy to read, full of strange characters and expertly rendered place. This brilliant genre-defying work will leave certainly a mark. It's my great pleasure to welcome Jonathan Lethem and Lysley Tenorio to the Pratt Library.
Thank you. So,
hi, Jonathan.
hi. Thank you for
welcome
doing
to
this.
Baltimore.
Thanks for welcoming me here, and thanks for doing this with me. So we agreed that I would read a little bit from the book first, so I'm going to do that. And I have picked out a couple of sections that one kind of slides into the next, and they don't need too much setting up. Move this around like this. They're concerning a character who goes by the initial C, although actually he only just gets that initial in this first page that I'll read. In general, this is a book where people struggle to have individual names. They're named with these honorifics or generic terms a lot of the time. But C gets at least this initial, and he's pretty important in the book. And these two sections are basically internal monologues for him that I think that explains enough. He's a black kid on this street, Dean Street, where there are all kinds of different people in collision and trying to figure out what it is to live together. And his role, as you'll see in this, is that he ends up taking care of a lot of the white kids in certain ways. So this is C, part 1. What is it that this black kid sees in them, his white friends? Or is it something he wants from them? Or wants to see in or want from him? What is it that drives him to offer his leadership to the white boys of Dean Street? To teach them to properly throw a Spalding off a stoop, or flick a Scully cap across the pavement, or boost a soda from the rear of a bodega. He even feels he needs to teach them to walk down the street properly, not to be craning their necks around backwards every 5 steps, telegraphing susceptibility for all to see. He teaches them every trick in the book of his body. Years before magical Negro was a notion you could only deplore and deride, certainly nothing ever to admit you'd consented to resemble, this one black kid from Dean Street had found himself cast in the part for every taker in a 5-block radius. What does it take to get a name around here anyway? Call him C. Now, restate the question. What is it that C sees in them? The answer may not be about something he sees in them, the white boys, at all. Sure, he sees them, but he feels their parents and his mom. C, he's a kind of parental tuning fork. He didn't ask for this power. Like most powers, it's a curse as much as a gift. C hears the parents when they speak and when they don't. But his awareness of the white parents comes later. First, inescapably, comes his attunement to his own mother. His mother, unlike his father, is from the islands. She's Haitian. She works as a nurse at Brooklyn Hospital in Fort Greene Park and brings home stories of horror from the emergency room. Specifically, the filthy condition of the white children's underwear when they appear with broken limbs from the playgrounds. The private school children from Brooklyn Heights, most of all. The richer, the filthier. You treat them like anyone else, she says about the white people, practically before he can know what she is talking about. They hardly know any better. C's father, who is from Bushwick, keeps it much simpler. Don't let them get you into trouble. Don't let them get you mixed up with the cops, because be assured the cops will be bringing you in, not them white boys. His mother's philosophy comes at him from all sides. It blurts from nowhere. She'd be cooking him eggs, teaching him to knot his bow tie for church, a thing he never did get exactly right. Her thoughts would float out like banners. You have to teach them who you are. Don't figure they already know. She will begin with some assertion plainly dubious to him, but never mind, for her it is gospel. It's your neighborhood, she says. You treat them like a guest in your house. Or, introduce yourself, look in their eyes. You call the parents Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so. Or, you see the dirt under the fingernails on that boy? Don't those people even know how to wash a child? Or, you walk that boy to school and you walk him back to the block after school. I don't care if you never speak one word the whole way. Among the many things his instincts command he protect the white children from, C will think ruefully so many years later, is the ferocious judgment of his mother. She glances at him as they step out on their way to church, sees his eyeballs sliding sideways to inventory the morning street, and says to him, they don't even know how to play right. It's like she knows before he knows what he'll be doing later that afternoon. The bow tie tossed aside to run outside and cajole some misshapen clump of white boys of different ages and capacities into a fair facsimile of a stickball game. Based on what? What did he know that they didn't? C based it all on some black and white footage of Willie Mays in a Harlem street, marking distances with the manholes, picking who's up first by every kid grabbing the stick until someone lands on top. Like his mother knows what he'll be doing before he knows, or maybe like she's making it happen. Maybe the answer is that simple. To the question of C's tenure as the white boy's champion and protector, his mother made him do it. Okay, and then this is about 30 pages later, and it continues. It's called C Part 2. Does C feel he lives in Borum Hill, or Gowanus, or South Brooklyn, or what? We can try to guess what he knows. He knows at least that he is a Dean Street kid. He knows this because his mother joins the Block Association. And recall that C is his mother's tuning fork. She hums, he vibrates. But this is decades before secret parent texting. Parent email groups, these don't exist. So like any other kid in this era, C is auditor to a lot of phone calls, to a lot of half phone calls, that is. You puzzle out the other side, like solving a standardized test by seeing what the questions imply about the answers. Or like certain comedy routines involving phone calls, rampant in this era. Bob Newhart, Lily Tomlin, the comedy of pauses. Like the words, "You don't say. You don't say. You don't say," pronounced with different emphasis. What did he want? He didn't say. C is a great student of television comedy, the mild ribaldry of Flip Wilson and Carol Burnett and Sonny and Cher, but also the sitcoms, the households of Maude and Good Times and All in the Family and the Jeffersons, the weird interpenetration of the white worlds by the black, the spinning off of one from the other. C monitors the Block Association phone calls in particular. How his mother sounds on the phone and again after she hangs up. They think I'm supposed to explain to them why some hoodlums from Gowanus houses want to pull down their new trees, she says, around the lighting of a Constellation cigarette. She meets these cigarettes out 2 or 3 a week, invariably after talking to some white people. Like I'm in charge of them jackass boys. And then, noticing him watching, she stubs the cigarette out. You know who's stripping those trees? No. Don't let me catch you. C would never dream of hurting the trees. Why not? By this time, he's become a rapt observer of the changes to the block. He tabulates the process, the physical fact of the transformation of the buildings themselves. He is unashamed in his admiration for the repointed brick. He's amazed by the persistence of new owners who trouble to replace the shattered sidewalk slate with fresh slabs of gray stone rather than mere poured concrete. These are people who want to live neither in the present nor the future, but in a cleaned-up dream of the past. He's fascinated at the sight of a moving van or the return of the truck full of Italian ceiling plaster specialists, or other Italians who will hoist a gleaming black new cornice and attach it to the roof in one afternoon. Something's always happening now. C feels enmeshed in the drama of the block's becoming. It is in this phase of his mother's involvement with the association, the phone calls and the meetings to which he is sometimes dragged, that C's field of vision expands, his vision of the street and his place in it, beyond his mother's wishes, both for him to flourish and to be justified. His vision begins to widen. Perhaps this marks the onset of C's sensitivity to the muddled up desires of the white parents themselves. At 5 years old, he's already felt his antenna vibrate to their delight when he plays with their kids. At ages 9, 10, and 11, then begins the leakage of their actual notions into his mind. Audible, whether they moronically pronounce these within his hearing or only emanate them at close range. The white parents might say, "What a little gentleman." Or, "Hey, slap me 5." Or, "I know you know what I'm talking about. See, he knows. Oh yeah, he knows." Or, "You keep up the good work." Or they might unpack this thought a bit further and say, See this, the sight of this, you have no idea. This is everything we fought for when we marched. Or, you like that? You can keep it if you like it. We'll buy another one. Or, it's remarkable. You just go anywhere you want, don't you? Is there a kid in this neighborhood you don't know? And am I crazy, or was that you I passed in the PS38 schoolyard playing basketball with a bunch of your other friends? I mean, those older kids, you know what I mean. Or, where's your father? When C wins over a new set of white parents, he sees them transform like phases of the moon. He can watch as their initial fears, their uptight, self-loathing reservations melt off into fond relief. Their relief is in thinking that this kid, their relief is that thinking that this street, this one mad block of it in particular, where all the kids mix and you don't know what's what, a scene so alluring, so threatening to the white mind, this street is going to be okay for their child. Whew. Their children will be ennobled by a black friend, whatever that means. Their children will be cooler with a black friend, and so will their parents. Whatever. Their children will also be safer with a black friend. Of this, there's no doubt. And he can deliver the goods. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks for reading that, Jonathan. Do you read your own books on tape? Do you do it?
I have once read a novel from beginning to end, and it was a very short novel, and it was very difficult work.
Yeah.
And otherwise, I read some of the essays and some of the short stories for another one where we had multiple readers, and I was just one of the readers. I think it's a real art form.
Uh-huh.
And I don't think I would be terrible if I tackled a really hard one or a very long one like this, but I found it exhausting and very challenging. So I don't presume that I would be the best person to do it.
I think you would be, though, because you have such a great clarity to your voice. And I've been watching some YouTube interviews, and I just thought, I hope if I can ever write a book again, I want you to do my book on tape. So we'll try to negotiate that later.
I'll think of that as a fallback position.
But thank you for reading that.
Yeah.
So I welcomed you to Baltimore when we first sat down, but part of me thinks everyone should also welcome you back to Brooklyn, because it's been, I think, 5 or 6 books since you have set one in Brooklyn. I know there was one in Queens, I believe, in the interim.
Yeah, it's a little tricky in that, right. I mean, I have Dissident Gardens is an outer borough New York City novel, and that the Queens, the kind of chip on the shoulder identity, the relationship to Manhattan in Queens is not wholly different from the Brooklyn version. But also there are scenes in that book, a few scenes in Brooklyn. And in fact, I snuck a couple of scenes in Brooklyn into a novel called The Feral Detective. But still, I know exactly what you're talking about. And it's really been 20 years. Fortress of Solitude was published 20 years ago.
Wow.
So in terms of taking it on fully like this, it's a very long time.
So could you talk about your relationship to Brooklyn? That's a big question. Yeah. So I'm just wondering maybe if you could just briefly talk about growing up in Brooklyn, and at what point you realized that you want or needed to write about it, and what brought you back to it after 20 years?
Yeah, it's a huge question, and I'll try not to just let that become the beginning of a giant monologue from me, because there are a lot of things we can talk about, but it's so essential. I'm also eager to think aloud. One of the things that I realized at some point was that I felt like the last of the old kind of Brooklyn writer, not the first of the new kind, or one of the first of the new kind. And that is to say, Brooklyn used to be fundamentally a place to get out of and put behind you. You know, like life was elsewhere. You and your parents wanted for you that you would vault over the bridge into Manhattan or elsewhere and not look back. And also, this was the case that although there were some writers who wrote about Brooklyn sometimes, and sometimes affectionately, they were often people who had gotten out. And often there were writers who were from there who didn't write about it a lot because it was like anything but that, or wrote about it barely, like Henry Miller, who's from Brooklyn and has, you know, a chapter in Black Spring, basically, where he dispenses with childhood in Brooklyn. Or Norman Mailer, who sets part of one novel. I mean, actually, I guess his whole second novel is set in a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, but it's a very muddled, weird novel, and he's not really writing about Brooklyn so much. And then otherwise, he mostly tries to not be from Brooklyn. And you know, you can see this archetype is still active into the 70s in the form of something like Saturday Night Fever, where like the whole concept is you're from this kind of podunk immigrant melting pot and real life is across that big bridge in Manhattan. Can you get out? And I absorbed this essence in me. And in fact, I both physically, we were just talking about, I lived in the Bay Area in my 20s, and that's where I began writing. And my first 3 novels make no reference to being from Brooklyn in any way. And they're set in either the Bay Area or some kind of weird other cartoonish version of the West in different ways, the desert and the California. And then in a book called Girl in Landscape, which was my 4th novel, I put the characters in Brooklyn just at the very beginning, and then they go to Mars. So it was also a getting out book. But I didn't, until really late in my development of my image of myself as a writer, think that I was going to be making anything out of this legacy at all. I know that must seem kind of weird now, because it's, you know, to the extent that anyone knows who I am or what I do, that's the first thing they would think about. And then I came up with this hard-boiled detective who had Tourette's. And I was just newly moved back to New York City. But I didn't think, I'm going to write a definitive Brooklyn novel. I just set it there because I was sort of weirdly turned on by being back on those streets, and I wanted to do something different with my character. And I started to think, well, you know, the streets of New York are verbally crazy, and he's verbally crazy, and this will go together really well. You know, I could use kind of New York vernacular, but it obviously clicked into something for me that was bigger than I understood. And then I developed this aspiration to write a great big Brooklyn coming of age story. And that was the next thing I did, was The Fortress of Solitude. And then I thought I was done. I was like, that was great. That's fine. And I also, circumstance caused me not so long after that to move to California again, where I live now, have continuously in Claremont, where I teach. And there are a lot of circumstances that lead me back to this experience of, in a way, trying to do like almost like a reset, or a go back to the source code, like start again. What is that material that I both obviously am fascinated by, appalled by, energized by, and that has caused me to become so deeply implicated with this place that at one part of my being, I just was like, let's be done, you know? So it's a sort of the sense of being implicated in something helplessly that I love and am exhausted by.
I had watched an interview with you, and you had said, and if I'm incorrect in this, you know, please correct me. When you were on tour for Fortress of Solitude, it was your book tour, but I think you said it kind of became a listening tour where you were listening to readers. I don't know if they were venting their grievances about Brooklyn or about your take on Brooklyn, or if they were trying to be corrective in some way. But could you talk about this idea of the listening tour eventually perhaps leading you back to
Yeah.
Brooklyn and this book?
Well, it's funny because I know the piece that you're thinking of, which in the classic manner of the internet got titled by someone who wasn't the author of the piece in order to juice up the hits. And the idea that I was listening to criticisms of the book got into that sort of headline. Chorus of critics, I think was the phrase. When I talk about the Fortress of Solitude listening tour, it was everything. It was a combination of people from my past who just found themselves compelled to come and reintroduce themselves to me and talk about what they'd seen in the book. Because I think I was naming portions of their experience. So I had a lot of just amazing reunions. It was people from an older Brooklyn who wanted to say that they knew about earlier experiences, and some of that is reflected in my interest in research. I wasn't much of a researcher at that point. I just wrote what I remembered and imagined. But it was also a lot of people identifying with the book in different ways, including lots of people who weren't from Brooklyn. I mean, this was even true if I went like to Ireland. I would be in Dublin, and some guy, kind of loosely my age would say, "I don't care." I can't do an Irish accent, but I don't care that the book is about Brooklyn. This is my life. You wrote my life. And I was like, well, in what sense is that true? It was interesting and compelling to me. But it was a listening tour fundamentally because the book drew voices towards me. There might have been some criticisms or corrections. More often, those were in my head. And, I did learn a lot. One of the weird things is the way, if you pick a subject and then you make a mark in space or time with it by writing a book, that doesn't mean that your learning ends there. In fact, it often triggers even more layers of understanding or activity or curiosity. So the book was open-ended for me in a way that I hadn't figured on and didn't really initially know what to do with, because I really felt also at the same time like I said what I needed to say. The book is complete. I'm going to do other things, which I did. As you pointed out, I did a lot of other things before circling back.
So I think a lot of readers will automatically link your books, or a good number of your books, to Brooklyn. Of course, it's said in other places as well. A lot of your readers would also link your books to the topic of crime.
Yeah.
Sometimes the crimes are overt murder. Sometimes they're maybe like crime adjacent, like backgammon gambling. I think that could somehow involve crime.
Yeah.
And now you've got crime in the title of the book. What draws you to crime as a consistent theme or concern? And maybe what are you doing with crime in this book?
Well, so there's a really particular story behind the title, which is worth telling because I think it gets to the answer to your question. When I agreed to do this book, it was the second book in a 2-book contract. The first one was a kind of post-apocalyptic pastoral called The Arrest, which was mostly written, so I could specify really clearly what the book was, and it had a title. And then, but the publisher, Echo, is your publisher as well, wanted, and I wanted to agree to have another book coming after that. And all I knew at that time was that it was going to be a book about Brooklyn. I thought that would please them, which I think it did, but I couldn't tell them anything more. So it was just like a 2-book deal for this very obviously written and clear thing called The Arrest and a Brooklyn novel. And then when the contract came back to sign, somebody at my publisher had inked in the place of the title, they'd inked in Brooklyn crime novel. And I mean, they didn't mean that was the title. They just thought that I intended to write a crime novel when all I'd said was I was going to write a Brooklyn novel. And this irked me. I was like really aggravated because I was like, all right, okay, they want me to do another Motherless Brooklyn. I never said it was going to have a crime in it. I never said it would have it was not a detective story. I'm not interested in cops and robbers. That's not what I was going to do. I'm sure it was done in a very, it was a blithe mistake. It wasn't a big deal. But in my head, this took on this import of someone trying to get me to do something. And then weirdly, as I began to live with this oddness, that I'd signed a contract for something called Brooklyn Crime Novel, because I did sign it. I said, it doesn't matter. It'll have a different title. You know, it'll have a title by the end. I'm going to write what I want to write. But then this notion that someone wanted from me a Brooklyn crime novel, and I didn't want to give it to them, became this like argument in my head that was really generative. It became the voice of the book saying, okay, you want a crime novel? Because I know some crimes. And it became this sort of, you know, the imaginary coercive editor asking me to do a Brooklyn crime novel. I was like, you're going to be sorry. I'm going to really do it. And I started to also identify with this idea that to write about Brooklyn was to write, my Brooklyn anyway, was to write about crime. That actually, this was the reason that I'd always been interested in crime fiction and done it a few times, was that I actually grew up in a space where a criminal outlook was essential. It was fundamental to being. And that I'd not necessarily enjoyed that or thought it was a good idea, but that it was still in me in a really defining way. And then I started to think, yeah, we were all criminals. We were all perpetrators and criminals. It was the basic premise of being a person in 70s and 80s Brooklyn. So every character in this book is going to have a powerful relation to that problem and that situation. And the book is going to be stuck inside that situation. And so I wrote the book out of this sense of grievance and inescapability of crime. And then by the end, I realized the thing that inked in the line was the perfect title for it. And so I embraced it as the title.
I love that. And I think I want to make a book contract writing prompt for my undergrads where I give them these titles. That's fantastic. So Brooklyn crime novel, crime is in the title. The book is about a range of crimes, some petty, funny, some more serious and quite consequential. It does seem in the abstract, but also in its consequence, the crime here, the main overall crime is gentrification. Could you talk, and I know you've written about that before, could you talk about how this latest book, what you're exploring there with this idea of gentrification?
Well, so one of the really weird things about this project is that word is hanging over it everywhere, understandably, rightly. But also the kind of work I did on the subject of what was specifically happening and continues to happen to the place I lived and to many other places is that I started to think that the word gentrification was a problem itself, because it was naming something with a false clarity. Like it, by having it to use, it suggests everyone knows what it is and is talking about the same thing. And I don't really believe that now. And there are, I'm not like flying out on a total limb of my own here. There are actually people who are writing now about the urban life from a political and sociological and historical standpoint, who think the word gentrification is like I say, kind of a placeholder for a lot of different things that are being all smashed together and that have not been understood completely. But now there's this word and we gesture with it, and it's like, see, we got that. We got it. There's a gentrification. Well, actually, what's underneath that word is paradoxical and intricate and not always what we think it is. But yes, I grew up in a place where there was radical change in a kind of what seemed like slow motion at the time, but was, then you use a longer lens, and it was always happening. It was steadily happening, and it continues to happen in that same place, which is most simply marked, obviously, by the price tag going up, but also by cultural change and changes in the diversity or racial makeup of the space. but also changes of the entire society around it. And one of the things that seems non-viable to me about the word gentrification is that it tends to mark off just one little area, as if like just controlling like who lives in this specific set of blocks is the whole problem, and the whole solution lies in controlling that or fixing it or making it right somehow. But actually the questions are enormously larger than a given neighborhood. They're questions of capitalism and our relations to one another in contemporary reality, that, you know, both being no one calls themselves pro gentrification, but both being on both sides of the gentrification idea, being an anti-gentrification person or being someone who's like, I just want to see the property values go up and more trees be planted and more shops that I like be there, and doesn't really feel bad about that. That neither of them are really actually in a framework that is going to get to the deeper issues. Because saying, you know, don't let this block change or let's have this block change is not really the story. But yes, I think a lot of people are feeling like if they're being challenged by this book to solve like, wait, what's the crime? You won't say what the crime is. You keep giving me examples, but what's the big crime? And they'll be like, it's gentrification. And it's certainly this kind of transformation and the context for it and the experience of it, often just at the intimate level, the bodily level, is something that I'm fascinated by and tried to infuse the book with.
Earlier, you talked about being often viewed as the definitive Brooklyn writer. And
there couldn't be a definitive one.
Right.
Yeah.
But you play with the idea here in this metafictional way. And it's it's a very funny part of the book, but it wouldn't be unreasonable for a reader to say, oh, Jonathan Lethem here is somehow inserting himself or someone like himself into the book. And he's kind of taken a task in these scenes. I mean, he's referred to as white boy Brooklyn novelist. And at a certain point, he is talking to, there's a character whose neighborhood nickname is the Wheeze. And things get a little uncomfortable. And the Wheeze, I'm going to just turn to the page real quick. So the white boy Brooklyn novelist is saying, what is it you think I did? The Wheeze is accusing him of something. The Wheeze says, you know what you did. Why don't you tell me? You gentrified gentrification. Could you talk about that gesture of, you know, introducing the, one could read as metafictional inclusion of the author, but also this idea of gentrifying gentrification. If gentrification itself is kind of like, you know, the umbrella crime and gives rise to a lot of the drama, suddenly the book is talking about gentrification as this kind of abstract idea, maybe this commodity, maybe in terms of literature. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, right. Well, so one of the things for me that's a permanent source of anxiety is that I kind of like a lot of things that are vernacular or rough around the edges or, you know, disreputable. But I seem to kind of like to also exalt them in a way that, you know, like before I was even writing about Brooklyn directly, I was a science fiction writer in part. But one of the things I liked to do was to make a really urgent argument, because it just felt really important to me in some way that sometimes now seems inexplicable, that science fiction could be taken very seriously and be literature too. Well, I've lived long enough that now it is taken very seriously, and it does seem like literature. And also sometimes it seems much less interesting to me. And if I am vain enough to think I'm responsible for any of that, it's a strange sensation. But, you know, the fact is that I've come to see certain kinds of involvement in the production of commodity as, we're all inside this machine and this system. And, when Fortress of Solitude came out, there were other artifacts. There was like Paul Auster's Smoke, and there were Spike Lee movies. And I would go to Europe and I would see like French kids wearing T-shirts that said Brooklyn on them. And I don't credit that to my book, but I did feel like the fantasy of street cred, of being a witness who's also kind of transcends, who is of a thing and transcends it, is really queasy. And I wanted to call it out. And, so the appearance of the character who's just called the novelist in the book, for me, was a shout out to Kurt Vonnegut's Breakfast of Champions, where his characters encircle him at one point and start getting to complain about their fate inside his fiction. And I thought I could use that in a way. My friend Dana Spiotta, I was writing this book, you can do the math and figure it out. I was writing it through the George Floyd moment and through the Me Too moment and convulsions of, questions of complicity and culpability that were gripping and also, made you heartsick on a daily basis. And a lot of activities seemed to need to be questioned to their very basis. And I, at the same time, I was a novelist and I wasn't much else. So I went on doing what I do, even through this time when it seemed to need maybe, not halting, but the deepest kind of interrogation. And I showed the earliest draft of this book to my friend Dana Spiotta, wonderful novelist who teaches at Syracuse. And she wrote back and said, in a time when it's really hard to tell whether you're punching up or punching down, punch self is a really great solution. So I like the way you decided on punch self.
Well, you did that very well. We do want to open this up to the audience, but I want to sneak one more question in very quickly. Reading this book feels like sort of being sat down in front of someone and being told gossip, being told anecdotes, and you kind of just go along for the ride. You're not necessarily burdened with, I need to remember this detail to follow this particular plot. I mean, those books are great too, but this is a very different kind of reading experience. You described the book, I think, in an interview with The Atlantic, that the book is like 100 novels and it's no novel at the same time. Could you talk about how you arrived at this structure?
Yeah. Well, so I had this feeling that, the one thing that this book has in common with the book that precedes it, The Arrest, is that both take narrative itself as maybe possibly the enemy, like something that needs to be kept in check because it's run amok in our world. Story making is, I think after the 2016 election and the kinds of narratives that seem to grip everything, erupting and being latched onto, I saw what I did a little differently, and then the intensifications of 2020, I realized that I wasn't content to write a book that didn't call the methodology into question, and at the same time, I was really into the multivocal feeling of this book. When you talked at the first question you asked about, or one of the first, about the listening tour, I had a lot of other voices in my head besides my own. And I doubled down on that. I went to people and I got them to tell me so much. And I kept throwing out these sort of provocations like, this is what it seemed like to me, but does that make sense? What did it seem like to you? And I wanted the book to be, now it was going to be my novel. I'm responsible for everything in it. But I wanted it to be as much as possible a vehicle for all of this contradictory multivocal energy. And so I wanted it to seem distributed and almost like a hologram, that it would only look like a thing when you turned it a certain way in the light, and then you turn it a little further and it would shatter into reflections on every wall. And honestly, it wasn't hard to get to that state. A lot of books are in that state at some point of being shattered. And I just was like, I'm gonna let the voice be the only glue, not some centralized narrative or character. I'm gonna let the thing that you were talking about, the sense that something is being worked on, that the voice is trying to solve a problem, that maybe that's enough. I could leave the rest of it in ruins, essentially, if the voice is urgent enough.
Great. I love that idea. That story is starting to run amok in the culture. We're going to open it up to the audience now. So I'm hoping people will feel free to approach the microphone and ask questions.
We have a microphone over here and one right over there. So if you want to get up and come on over.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. I was just curious, you had mentioned Me Too, George Floyd, and all these other crimes or considerations. How do you respond to that as an artist? Do you think you internalize that and let it come out? Or do you ever feel directly called to respond to, I don't know, banning books or things that directly challenge?
Oh, yeah. And you mean to find an activist gesture? Yeah. Thank you. I think that I tend to want to do those as a citizen and as a participant, not to extend the idea of the author as a kind of a cultural authority figure. So rather than, this is just an inclination. I think some people wield maybe that role comfortably and effectively, where they sort of, whether it's Salman Rushdie or whomever. There are a number of people who I do think can project authorial roles into activist positions. I'm more inclined to go and just be in the demonstration or work in my community. And I've done some of those things. Of course, we always are all feeling that we should be somehow doing more than we are. But anyway, it's at that level that I move that desire more as a local person, a member of a community of citizens where I live or in a virtual space, but not as Jonathan Lethem says. Does that make sense? Yeah. Thanks.
Other questions?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I've read the Beastie Boys book, and I think you had a piece there. And did you go to high school with, like, they call the world's first white rapper?
I know what you're thinking of, and I can sort it out. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and I just 50th anniversary of hip hop this year is what we're celebrating, I guess. And they are obviously still thinking about those things from what you read earlier. So any thoughts? Yeah.
Absolutely. So the person you're thinking of is actually my brother, Blake Lethem, known as his graffiti name, which is more famous than his rap name, is Keo, K-E-O, and his name as a rapper was Lord Scotch. And if you Google, you'll find both of those names out there, and lots of tall tales, because he is an incredible raconteur, and has a increasingly, in some ways, a secure place as a kind of woulda, coulda, shoulda anomalous figure in the history of hip hop, because he was in a band that before they were signed that became Third Base, and he also was a sort of a fellow traveler with a lot of important rappers, and my brother is weirdly enough the guy who designed MF Doom's mask, and was very tight with him and with Slick Rick and a bunch of other people. And there was the first white rapper thing, which is ridiculous, of course. But there was a moment long ago now in the 90s, I think, when Rolling Stone, that imperially white magazine, decided that white rap was a thing and it needed to devote a special issue to white rap. And so they went to the people who at that time were they thought would be the authorities, which is to say they went to Third Base and the Beastie Boys and a couple other people to MC Search and said, are you the first, or who was the first? And a few of them pointed to my brother as the first white kid they'd ever seen rap. And so when they made the magazine did a thing called the Timeline of White Rap. And my brother, MC Scotch, was the first item on the timeline of white rap. So that's either a very appalling piece of nonsense, or it's total street cred. And he's managed to turn it into a career as a yarn spinner. But a lot of his stories got into the Fortress of Solitude, more in some ways than into Brooklyn crime novel, because I was more focused on the lives of artists of all kinds in the Fortress of Solitude, street artistry of various kinds, and the graffiti life, but also soul singers and fine arts painters. That one of the subjects of that book was how people translate their experience through art. This book, much less so. And so, yeah, thanks for asking.
Other questions?
Talking about both Leslie's last question, this sort of like multivocal book, and also just writing a novel that is in some ways like a public history, right? Or a group history of a place. I'd love to hear if you had guidebooks or books that you love that sort of showed you a path or a way, or what was kind of in the water or on your studio wall as you worked on this.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Sam, that's a great question. In searching for a form and for a compass for the form that I wanted to put this book into, I mentioned Vonnegut weirdly. And I think that there's a way in which he, if you think about those introductions that he writes to his novels, if you know his work, where he'll just say, I can't do this the normal way. I'm going to have to just talk to you directly. He's very plain spoken. This book isn't quite so plain spoken. In fact, it's a kind of dodgy version of that, because it starts out with a collective we, and then halfway through the book it breaks down and says, you know what, I can't sustain this pronoun. I'm not a we. There's just one of me trying to figure this shit out. But it does do this sort of direct address, this fourth wall breaking. One of the things that I actually realized I was leaning on as sustenance was not another novelistic example, but a genre that I really obsess over in cinema called the essay film. I was thinking about Chris Marker and Orson Welles' F for Fake and Agnes Varda, and that somehow the way this book wanted to encompass different modes or fragments, but have there be also plainly this voice that was just like, and now this. Okay, come over here and look at this with me. That I was drawing on, Ross McElwee. He makes these amazing films, Time Indefinite, and there's one called Sherman's March. And I think that I was, at some point, I realized this is helping me to think of this book as an essay film, which is really weird because a novel is neither an essay nor a film. But it helped me. The other thing that's a weird thing to say is that the example that some early readers gave me when they were like, "Oh, what's this?" Because the book incorporates some documentation and is so fractured, they said, "Oh, Dos Passos," and I was like, "Well, that sounds great. He's very famous," but actually, I never read Dos Passos because when I tried to, I found it unreadable. I mean, I'm sure it's amazing. It's great, but I didn't relate to it at all. But I still think maybe in some way that it exists is just a distant lodestone or pole star. I'm mixing up things here. That I was like, well, yeah, modernism. There's modernism, right? I could maybe claim it for that. But I was really just making this thing in a much more intimate way. I didn't have a formal idea that was like, oh my God, I'm gonna reinvent the novel like a modernist would. Honestly, I just was making this thing be the vehicle for the feelings, the kind of catastrophe of overload of feelings and ideas that I was having. I was just like, stuff them all in, cope, deal with it, move to the next thing. Yeah, thanks.
We have time for one more question.
All right. Well, what if I could ask you to talk about your relation to another Baltimore author, not a native, but a man who did most of his, probably his best work here, Stephen Dixon.
Ah, great.
Of course, you knew him personally and spoke very warmly about you. Now, it always seemed, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out the connection between your work and his, particularly the reason that, well, what you admired about his work, you and not only, and other people of your, say, circle of generation, think of people like Ben Marcus, and, Steve Eggers. Yeah, how you felt about it, or what inspiration, that's the word, or what stimulation you found in him?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Dixon is an incredible writer who's very hard. I mean, outwardly it's possible to imitate him for like a few pages. And I even have one short story, I won't tell you which one, that I feel I wrote out of the urge to do Dixon's voice. But he's a very uncanny author in his effects, and it's hard to believe, you know, like a number of great writers, it's hard to believe that he existed, you know, that somebody figured out how to be this way, and he was so persistent and did it so much of what he does, and it's so well, and you can go to it and just be astonished over and over again. So I don't know how to form the bridge that you might be asking, sort of between my work and his, but I think of it as a replenishment every time I read him. The things that I identify with in some ways are just his materiality, his willingness to write about his ordinary experience and his obsessions without any mediation. And he's a very urban writer. You know, I mean, his early books, I think especially, I mean, there's even one just called Work. And they're really about dailiness and the kind of crisis of getting up in the morning and being in urban space. You know, and I associate him with, in some ways, with some writers who are seen almost more as kind of, well, a couple that are seen very specifically as Brooklyn writers, Gilbert Sorrentino and Hubert Selby, Last Exit to Brooklyn, in this dense, obsessive interest in prosaic, you know, what it's like to walk into a room, what it's like to get in a bar fight or a street incident, or trudge up the stairs after a day of work and deal with the expectations of your family members, you know, which they all engage with in their different language registers, but that seems related to me. I don't think I've reflected in some ways such a simple commitment to that, but it really means a lot to me to go to that source and be challenged by it. And it's funny, I was really thinking about Dixon as I'm publishing this novel and I'm moving to what I want to write next. And there was a way in which I was like really clear. I was like, I think I have to read and reread some Dixon to get a grip on how I want to approach this. I'm a person who my language gets kind of fancy if I'm not careful. Like I have to clarify it because I read so many books before I knew how to be a person. The books, I revert to the books, and a lot of the books were written by, like, you know, Victorian Englishmen. So I have to sometimes get back to basics. I don't think that was a struggle for Dixon. And I don't mean that as a subtle diss, like he's just some earthy, autodidact. He was an incredibly sophisticated reader and writer, but his language came out rooted and plain, whereas I sometimes find my language floating off into, sounding like fake E.M. Forster if I don't remember that that's not me. And so I was thinking about how I want to, and of course the next idea I have for a book is kind of fancy idea too. It has all sorts of curly cues in its themes, and there's a lot of political stuff I want to pack into it. And I was like, but this needs to be written in a human language, and I better read some Dixon. So thanks for bringing him up.
Well, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you so much, Jonathan, for the
you.
conversation. Congratulations on the
Thank you.
book.
Thank you, Lysley.
Again, I want to thank our moderator, Lysley Tenorio. And tonight's author, Jonathan Lethem. Okay, we'll be outside in about 5 minutes. Jonathan will be happy to sign your book or books. And again, Greedy Reads is outside selling them. Please buy them. We'll see you in line. Sophia over here will be able to manage the line, get in line behind her. We'll see you in a couple minutes. Thanks for coming out.
I have done.